Hello, welcome to the Family Research Council on Facebook. And my name is Peter Sprigg. I'm a senior fellow for policy studies here at Family Research Council in Washington, D.C. And we're delighted to have with us two very special guests in our studio today, Walt Heyer and Dr. Michelle Cretella. Walt, we're going to be talking about the issues of the transgender movement and gender identity, gender dysphoria, some of those topics today, and how they impact public policy. Walt comes at this issue from a personal perspective, and he has a very interesting personal story that he's going to share with you. And Dr. Cretella is a pediatrician and the executive director of the American College of Pediatricians, a group which has done a lot of really helpful work on this issue as well. So I'm going to start with the personal story, though, because transgender activists, they often have made a lot of progress by sharing their personal stories and trying to win compassion for their personal stories. But your story is a little bit different from the one that they tell. You are a biological male, yes, who lived as a female for a number of years. Mm-hmm. So can you tell us what was it that initially led you to transition to a female identity?
Yeah, well, it started in 1944, which just seems like so long ago. But my life started much like it does for many kids today, and that is I was affirmed by my grandmother when I was 4 years old, cross-dressing in a purple dress. She seemed to really delight to it, and I liked being affirmed. You know, it's one of the things that's going to draw you in as a young 4-year-old child is, I mean, who's going to push back on being affirmed when people are saying how cute or how wonderful you are? You're going to take it in, you're going to internalize it. And in some cases, like in my case, it became so evident to me that there must be something wrong with me as a boy because I wasn't getting affirmed as a boy. And I think what's interesting is when my grandmother was affirming me as a little girl, she didn't realize this, but I could see that I knew something must be wrong with me as a boy if she's affirming me as a girl. Mm-hmm. So two things happen when you affirm a young child is that you're breaking them of who they really are, because that little boy got broken because, well, why aren't you affirming me as a boy? What's the matter with my little cowboy boots and my torn up blue jeans? But you're affirming me in a purple chiffon dress. So that begins what we call gender dysphoria, gender confusion, and depression as well, because you become depressed about how come they don't like me as a little boy. And so you begin that depression, and also anxiety builds in you. It's like, so you have this conflict that started within me when I was 4 years old. It didn't go away. It continued to grow. And so throughout life, I would go to bed at night, sometimes taking an hour to go to sleep, troubled by what was going on, not really understanding what Grandma was doing, because I was way too young at 4 years old to know the consequences long term. Didn't know her motives. I knew that I wanted to be affirmed. I knew that I wanted to be loved, and she felt like that's what she was doing. And so as I grew into this idea about changing genders, it sort of took on its own life. And by 1952, I didn't have any words like transgender or gender dysphoria. I just knew that Grandma liked me as a girl. And in 1952, Christine Jorgensen came out as the first sex change surgery that spread across the headlines. And I went, oh, well, that must be me. I mean,
So you remember Christine Jorgensen?
Yeah, I mean, because this was 1952.
Wow.
By this time, I was 12 years old. Very imprinting time in a young person's life. And so you began to then think, oh, okay, well, maybe Grandma was right. There was something wrong with the boy, this girl thing, and now Jorgensen. So you have all there's another affirmation, isn't it, that you see this in the headline. That's the first time I knew about the word. And so I began to silently take on another name. I took on an internal name called Crystal West, and I would think about becoming a girl when I was 12 years old. And went through this whole process. But strangely, most people don't understand this. I never had homosexual thoughts. This was just an identity, a confusion in my identity about who I was. It wasn't about sexuality. And so I never had a homosexual thought. But the purple dress, what's so interesting about that purple dress is that by the time I was 8 or 9 years old, people in my family began to find out, about what was going on because it became a discussion. And my uncle, who was in his teens, adopted, began to sexually molest me because of the purple dress.
Oh, dear.
So if you look at what Grandma did and take the purple dress out, the boy would have been okay, and the boy wouldn't have been sexually molested before he was 10 years old, and the boy never would have identified with Christine Jorgensen. So you have so many things happening in this 8-year period between the age of 4 and 12,
Wow.
all hugely impacting on my psychology, on what I was, who I was, and how I was going to identify. And so as I moved through school, I had a girlfriend. Her name was Lola Joy Phipps. I mean, who doesn't want a girlfriend named Lola Joy Phipps? I mean, it's like the best name in the world for a girl, So she was my girlfriend, and I was on the track team. I was a kicker on the football team, although I barely weighed 130 pounds. I was scrappy. And I ran. I was fast. And so I moved all through school with this kind of two different identities, one inside and one outside. And so it wasn't, we're talking 1950s. Nobody talks about transgenders, and it wasn't the topic like it is today. And so I eventually got married, had 2 children. I had gone to school. I became an associate design engineer, working on cryogenics for the Apollo space missions. Went on to work in the auto industry as a national operations manager for ports of entry, and had a successful career. But that purple dress kept haunting me, to the point to where I finally fell into alcoholism. I went for help from a gender therapist, and he told me, well, you needed hormone therapy and you need a surgical gender change. I divorced my wife after 15 years and became Laura Jensen in 1983. And not long after that, I lost my job. I was homeless for a
Now,
period.
can I stop you there?
Absolutely.
And jump to Dr. Cretella now to talk about, we've heard about your childhood, and we see here, on the one hand, we have the behavior in terms of wearing this dress, although you were encouraged, and then you have the way that adults responded to you. Right. With that behavior was very significant. And so I wanted to ask you the question, Dr. Cretella, about the difference between gender nonconforming behavior and being transgender. If a boy puts on a dress or plays with a doll, or a girl plays with the truck, does that automatically mean that they're transgender?
Right. Actually, I'm even going to go just one little step back, because we have to be careful when we're saying, is there really someone who's transgender, right? So transgender, no one's born transgender.
Right.
There are people, including children, with transgender beliefs. So to get to your question, no, breaking sex stereotypes does not mean that the child believes they're transgender. So the two are not the same. You can have a girl who is very tomboyish. I have 4 children, and our last one is a little girl. She followed in her brother's footsteps. She followed them everywhere. Wanted nothing to do with dolls. She was rough and tumble until she actually got to school more like about 1st grade. Then she got into the girl stuff. Same thing as you said. If you have a boy who he's in preschool and he goes to the dress up area and grabs a princess dress because it's there, puts it on, that does not mean that this is a child who's going to be transgender.
So is there any scientific evidence that some children are born with a gender identity that's different from their biological sex?
No. And this is how we know. There's absolutely no medical test, no blood test, no genetic test, no brain test, where you can say, there's the person's sex and there's their gender identity. People have sex, nouns have gender. So we have a biological sex determined just by our genes at fertilization, stamped into every single cell of our bodies, including our brains, in utero, We can look by ultrasound and you can say, hey, congratulations, you're having a boy or you're having a girl. Sex is in the body. Gender identity, how I believe, what I believe about myself, how I feel about my body, that forms over time, and it's after birth experience that forms it.
Okay, now, if Walt had been born or was growing up at this time instead of in the 1950s, he might have had a different experience medically. Tell us a little bit about the protocol that's now being followed for children who are identified by some people as transgender.
Sure. So what's very frightening is that in pediatrics and psychology today, if a child either breaks sex stereotypes or outright says, I'm not a boy, I'm not a girl, is saying that they are the opposite sex, in these cases, parents are being told, look, your child was born transgender, this is who they are, and you have to socially transition them. Go ahead, change their names, change their whole hairstyle, and dress as the opposite sex, get everyone to play along. And when your child gets to be between the ages of 9 and 12, well, now we're going to give them medicine to block puberty. All right, puberty is not a disease. Okay, when our thoughts don't match our physical bodies, that could be confusion, it could be an emotional disturbance, or a true mental illness. Okay, we support that child in reality. That's what we should do. We should embrace that child and help the child embrace his or her true body, because this is our identity. Our identity is rooted in reality, and we should help children come to that.
I was going to mention too that these puberty blocking drugs exist because there are some children who have a condition that causes them to have premature puberty.
That's right.
So the drugs exist because you don't want a child to go through puberty at the age of 5, for
Right.
example. They put them on these puberty blockers, and then when they get to be 12 or something, you take them off. But here you're talking about putting a child on it 9 or 10 or something and having them stay on them until they're 18 or 16 or whatever.
So what the activists are doing, so right, puberty is not a disease, but if you have early puberty, that is a disease condition. So the FDA does approve puberty blockers for early puberty. But healthy children who are put on blockers, you're now blocking their normal development.
Right.
So you're slowing their growth. You are blocking normal brain development, because the children's brains need their sex hormones, but they're not getting those with the blockers. We know that from other studies, when the blockers are used to treat the early puberty, that you can develop very brittle bones, particularly in the girls. The boys have an increased risk of testicular cancer, obesity. Lupron, the most common puberty blocker, is FDA approved for treating prostate cancer in men, and it's approved to treat endometriosis in women. Some of the side effects when we use it appropriately there, long-term memory problems in the adults. So we're putting physically healthy kids at risk for these same side effects, for abnormal thinking. And what's worse is that if these young children were instead supported through their natural puberty, supported with therapy for the family and the child together, finding ways to help their underlying anxiety or underlying depression in ways that they could still embrace their bodies, they will outgrow that gender confusion by late teen years.
Right, there's evidence of that. Now let me jump back to Walt's story. So you did transition in the early 1980s. What led you to detransition?
Yeah.
Some people watching may not even be aware that there are people who have detransitioned or people who are former transgenders. So tell us about that experience.
Yeah, I was studying at UC Santa Cruz. I was studying psychology and addictions and other things in the university program there. And I went to the library and got this book on transgender issues, and I think it was from Cornell, and opened it up, and there was a story in there about a person who had separation anxiety that they had also diagnosed with gender dysphoria because the person had lost their mother and wanted to actually, it was his way of dealing with the loss of his mother. He actually took on his mother's identity as a female himself and became a female so that he would feel like his mother was still there. I mean, that's the deep psychological, one of the things. And I began to see other stories about people having many different kinds of mental disorders that are never addressed prior to giving people hormone therapy and surgery. So that's where I became very interested in looking at my own life. I realized that the sexual abuse had caused me to have not multiple personalities, but a dissociative disorder. In other words, you begin to feel distressed about who you are, which is, by the way, 29.9% of the transgender population suffer from dissociative disorder. So it's a very common disorder in the community. So when I began to do that, then I went for therapy, which is significantly important. And it's that therapy that allowed me to be here, because the therapy is what restored me along with my faith in Christ. But so I needed to deal with what had happened. And so when you have sex abuse or trauma, I mean, somebody being sexually abused, it's a crime, and it's traumatizing. So the individuals who suffer this actually need good, sound, effective psychotherapy, and the people who perpetrate it need to be in jail.
Well, this is, I think, an important point, that because we want to emphasize that people who have these feelings need our compassion. But what the transgender movement is offering them is not what is going to help them.
That's right.
The transition, that this psychotherapy to deal with their underlying issues would actually be much more compassionate than having,
Than ignoring them.
right, than having the hormones and surgery and so forth, and ignoring the underlying mental health issues. I wanted to ask you, Dr. Cretella, about when we're hearing more and more about schools teaching about transgender issues, and we have drag queen story hour in the for little children and so forth. Is there a danger to normal children who do not have feelings of gender dysphoria from teaching them these concepts?
Absolutely, and particularly in the toddler years and the teen years, and I'll take the toddler years first because they're the target of the drag queen story hours, and now the gender ideology is being taught even outside of sex education. So you're getting gender ideology preschool through grade 12. Children by the age of 3 can usually identify themselves correctly as a boy or a girl, but it's not until age 5 that they will understand, oh yeah, a girl grows to be a woman and a boy grows to be a man. It's not until age 7 that most children understand sex is permanent. So children under age 7, if they will actually believe that a man who gets all dolled up in makeup and clothes and dresses actually becomes a woman. So when you are taking children who just cognitively and psychologically, they don't have that development or knowledge to understand about the permanence of sex, and you take them and bring them to story hours where these drag queens, which are basically homosexual men dressed as women, reading them gender bender stories, we are gaslighting our kids. We're gaslighting them. That's the most fundamental reality we have. One of the first ones we encounter is our physical bodies. So if our young children cannot trust our physical bodies, who or what can they trust?
And I've heard at least anecdotal accounts of children who don't have gender dysphoria who become frightened that they are going to turn into the opposite sex. They don't understand that this is something, this is a deep-seated feeling that some children have, and if you don't have those feelings, you don't need to worry about it. Right. They become afraid that their sex is unstable.
Especially, and you can understand. Again, these are, in fact, that was a kindergarten that has happened more than once. I've in kindergartens across the country. They're getting read stories like I am Jazz. I was born with a girl's brain and a boy body. What? I mean, okay, there's no science there. That's complete science fiction. Doesn't happen. Or they get read another story about a teddy bear who's, at the beginning of the book, he's wearing a bow tie and he's so sad, and he goes through talking to his little boy owner, and by the end of the book realizes he can move his bow tie to his head and become Tilly. I'm really a girl bear. Little preschoolers being read these stories, yeah, it is very confusing. And those fears and that confusion can lead children down a path that's going to put them on toxic, very dangerous puberty blockers and cross-sex hormones. I mean, we didn't mention this, but I was talking about the brittle bones and increased risk of testicular cancer and obesity in boys. But once you get to cross-sex hormones plus the puberty blockers, these little children are permanently sterile now.
And I think you said you were going to talk about what happens to adolescents or teens from this movement as well.
Right, and I know Walt will be able to speak to this as well. But so if you, if as a child you escape the transgender ideology until your teen years, at that point, a teenager's job is to try on different roles. You're trying to figure out who you are, and every teenager has a certain amount of angst. And what we are seeing now, especially online, in chat rooms, on YouTube, Reddit, Tumblr, all over the place, normal teenage angst. The solution to that, transgenderism is being proposed as a solution to that. It's being proposed as a solution to teenage depression, to teenage anxiety. There are actually men who have, quote, transitioned to women. They're technically autogynephiles, but they are out there, and they are promising these kids, oh, I had those same symptoms when I was your age. This means you were born transgender. This is what you have to tell your parents so that they take you to a gender therapist. This is what you have to tell the therapist so that you'll be given hormones. And if your parents don't support you, if they won't call you by your chosen name, if they won't call you by your chosen pronouns, they are abusive parents. We'll be your glitter family. I mean, there's an entire cult built around this on the internet that parents need to be aware of. And we're having entire peer groups of teenagers coming out transgender. So it's not something you're born with. This is something that is entirely, largely environmental. You might have kids who are predisposed to certain personality traits or mental illnesses, but without the social dimension, this would not be happening.
So Walt, once you got the psychological help you needed, you decided to reclaim your male identity. Have you communicated with other people who have gone through the same sort of struggle?
Yeah, we started.
Tell us about your website.
Yeah, we started a website, Sex Change Regret, 10 years ago, and we've had as many as 350,000 people visit the site in 1 year. We steadily get over 200,000, 225,000. And from that, we get people contacting me who want to detransition, who have regret. They want to know, how do they get their life back? In fact, the headline on the website is, you can have your life back, or time to get your life back. Mm-hmm. And so we have a lot of stories in there, individual stories. So there's been, we've posted so many stories. We've written 6 books that articulate these stories. And so, yes, and they're all broken people. 100% of the ones that I've worked with over the last 10 years are able to identify the event, the time, the episode, or what it was that was the onset of their idea. Wow. That they were transgender or didn't like who they were because of something would happen to them. And the stories, some of them are very, very gripping and heart-wrenching. About half of them were sexually abused. The other half, a variety of different things happened to them where they just didn't want to be who they were, and the option was to become a female because they could get affirmed and loved on like I was. It's a false way of dealing with the hurt you have, and actually changing genders will actually cause you deeper regret, and likely you'll increase your possibly having suicide. I attempted suicide. I wanted to kill myself after changing gender. It's very common. And what we know from all the studies is that people generally desist from identifying as a transgender somewhere between 5 and 15 years. There's the bulk of them. Some will happen before, some after. I've had them contact me as early as 3 weeks after a surgical gender change saying they regret it, can you help me? To two people 30 years after the surgery saying it took me 10 or 15 years to admit what I did was wrong, but can you help me?
I was going to mention another resource, the film Transformed.
Yes.
Are you part of that film
Yes,
as
I
well?
am.
Yeah, there's a video that's available. It's Transformed with a Z instead of the S. You can probably just Google that. I'm not sure exactly where to get it, but it has the testimony of a number of people like
15,
yourself.
I believe.
Yeah, who have gone through this kind of experience. And as you said, one of them, I think he said he woke up from the operation and said, what have I done?
Yeah.
You know?
Yeah.
So, and Dr. Cretella, when we're talking about these issues, I wondered if you would share the story I've heard you share a couple of times about the little boy who then had a sister born who had special needs and what that did.
Right, exactly. So oftentimes while there's definitely a population of individuals who suffer severe trauma, be it physical, emotional, or verbal trauma, and sexual abuse, there are other children or teenagers where it's simply innocent family dynamics that subconsciously get misinterpreted in the child's mind. So little Andy, between the ages, or at age 3, had a sister born with special needs. And so his parents went from focusing only on him to putting 99% of their time into his little sister. From Andy's perspective, as a 3-year-old little boy between ages 3 and 5, he internalized, mommy and daddy love girls. They don't love me anymore, they love girls. His parents didn't know that was what was going on. I didn't know, but this was back in 2010 where I could still refer to therapists and a full evaluation would be done. So over 2 or 3 months of play therapy with the family and with Andy, it came out one day, Andy, you holding a Barbie in one hand and a truck in the other. Mommy, Daddy, you don't love me when I'm a boy. And now the therapist had something to work with. And again, there were nothing abusive was going on, but you could work together with that therapist and the family and the therapist and Andy through the rest of the year. It was enough to bring him back to realize that he could be confident as a boy. And yes, his mom and dad did love him for the son he is.
Well, I want to move on now to some of the policy issues, public policy issues, and you've been gracious enough to share on Capitol Hill today with members of Congress and their staffs who are considering a number of pieces of legislation that would make gender identity into a protected category under civil rights laws, notably one called the Equality Act, which would include sexual orientation and gender identity as protected categories. Walt, let me get your point of view on this. Do you think that gender identity is really comparable to other characteristics that are usually protected under civil rights laws, like race?
Absolutely not. Not even close. And so we have, as we've explained, we've talked about the different dynamics. These are people who've either been fed this information by adults. We're manufacturing transgender people. We're manufacturing either by adults giving them the idea they're transgender or a doctor giving them treatment for transgender. Absent of all that, we would have no transgenders because they don't exist beyond the fact that we have people promoting the idea that they're transgender. As Dr. Cretella said, there's absolutely no proof whatsoever anywhere that even one transgender exists. The studies they have done haven't...
There's no scientific test or medical test you can do.
That's right. I mean, beyond somebody self-identifying as a transgender, which we're using, to build law around seems so incoherent and so foolish that we've gone down this path. And I think that's why we're seeing so many in this population that are attempting suicide, that are distressed, they're alcoholics, they're drug addicts, and they're falling into the hands of being dependent on government in many cases. And so it's a horrible way to go because people do not biologically change genders. It doesn't happen. It's no more than what I call a Halloween costume that you wear every day. That's as far as you can get with it because you cannot change who you are.
All right. And Dr. Cretella, I wanted to ask you about one of the issues that's come up with respect to gender identity protections in public accommodation laws, which is, what does this do for the privacy and safety of women and girls?
Sure. I mean, you can't. If we protect gender identity as if it were a trait like sex, you eliminate girl and women rights. There are no women's rights. Why? Because any man, any boy can simply proclaim, I'm a girl. All you have to do is say it. Being transgender, okay, transgender people are real in the same sex that anorexic people are real. An anorexic person is a man or a woman who has anorexia, which is an emotional or mental disorder. Transgender people are a man or a woman, men or women, who have a disorder. So in public accommodations, if we protect gender identity, any man can walk into a woman's restroom. Any man can walk into a women's locker room, a women's domestic shelter, homeless shelter, a women's prisons. They can be housed with the women.
Or a battered women's
home. Yes, and this has happened. And in fact, there are many lawsuits now around the country. Women in, I know of one in Fresno, California. I believe there are 6 women who were sexually assaulted by a man. He identified as a trans woman. The shelter took him in. It's open showers. He, so again, violated them in various degrees. There's a lawsuit for that. There is a lawsuit that is going on in Georgia. A 5-year-old little girl in kindergarten was sexually assaulted in her elementary school bathroom by a male classmate who identifies as non-binary. So women and girls' safety goes out the window. And this is not a bigoted statement. It is reality. Women have fallen prey to male violence for eons. It's just a fact. It's a biological fact that men are bigger, taller, stronger, faster. That's biology. And that is why we've always protected women's spaces.
Right.
And women's sports. That is why we have women's sports, because it's an unfair advantage.
Yes.
You know, so if you protect gender identity, you don't have men's sports and women's sports. You have men's sports and co-ed sports.
Well,
yeah.
thank you so much.
I get riled up.
Yeah, thank you so much. I want to give you each a chance to mention again your website where you can get more information. Dr. Heyer, Walt, what's your...
Well, thank you for the new title.
Yeah, sorry,
yes.
yeah.
Sexchangeregret.com and waltheyer.com, and you can look at all the research, and there's books available that I've written. There's 6 of them.
And the American College of Pediatricians?
The American College of Pediatricians is acpeds, acpeds.org. And please also look up Hands Across the Aisle Coalition. Wonderful women. This is an issue that spans the political spectrum. So Hands Across the Aisle Coalition, we are conservative and progressive women who are united in protecting children and women. We don't want to be erased.
Great. And Family Research Council is at frc.org. There are a number of papers that we have available on our website as well, dealing with the transgender issue and issues of gender identity. Once again, Walt Heyer, Dr. Michelle Cretella, thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you so much. Thank you.